Hello. Nice to see you here today. Today I'm going to talk about Ernest B. Haight, and he's a Nebraska quilt maker who made quilts for about 50 years. He was also trained as an engineer, and thus the title of the presentation today is The Engineer Who Could, the Quilt Making of Ernest B. Haight. I want to thank the Lincoln Quilters Guild and the Center for Great Plains Studies for their support of the research behind this. And just to give you an idea of what is this presentation will cover, I'm going to talk about the making of an engineer, and then I'm going to talk about the puzzler. Then we're going to talk about the process. We're going to talk about some styles of quilt making that Ernest B. Haight was especially fond of. And then at the end, we're going to talk about why does this matter. So we're going to jump right into the making of an engineer. A lot of what I'm going to say is not information that people who are familiar with Nebraska quilt making will find too revelatory, but I do have some new information. Others have spent some time looking into Ernest Haight's background and especially his quilt making years towards the end of his life. What I've tried to do is go back and look at the beginning of his life and try to understand what made Ernest Haight who he is, who he was, and what influenced his quilt making. And I believe that a lot of it was that he was trained as an engineer. But let's even go a little further back. The Haight family came to Nebraska in the 1870s as homesteaders near what was later founded David City. Like many homesteading families, they were a self-sufficient group. They worked the land, they got their living from it. This is, according to family, a sod house that the original Haight settlers had built and lived in on their homestead stake. One of the things that came with them on this trip was a sewing machine, by the way, a treadle sewing machine that was brought in the wagon from Wisconsin. Ernest's grandparents on both sides had been homesteaders, the Haight family and also the Burr family. His mother is Flora Burr Haight. She's in the front row, and little Ernest is sitting next to her on the ground with some of his grandparents. One of the things that was typical on a homestead at that time and in the early 1900s was a machine shop on the farm. Unlike today, a family couldn't go into the parts store to buy this and that. They often had to make what they needed. And so this picture is from much later, probably the 1940s. Excuse me. However, it represents what a shop might have looked like. Ernest Haight worked in his farm's shop, and one of the things he made was a steam engine. He built a steam engine as a teenager. It later blew up, and his father just denied him the opportunity to make another one. But of course they had to use other forms of power than we would use now, electricity and all. So one of the tools in this machine shop was a jigsaw that was run with a treadle. So those who are familiar with treadle sewing machines, it's the same mechanism. It's a foot pedal that turns the motor. This was a talented family. This is the Haight family's fife and drum corps. In the back is Ernest's father and his mother next, and then Ernest is over here to the right of his parents, and then his younger brother Lewis and his youngest brother Elton on the far side. Elton died in high school. He was drowned at a camp, unfortunately. Well, Ernest went through school in David City, and then as soon as he graduated from high school in 1917, he ended up enlisting in the U.S. Army. The Haight family their heritage was Quaker, and so they were pacifist. But Ernest determined that he needed to do something, and so he figured the Signal Corps would probably keep him from being in places where he would actually have to take up an arm and have to inflict a mortal wound. And so he did enlist. He went through the training, but the war ended before he actually was deployed into service. Upon completing his military service, he entered the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and he began his studies in agricultural engineering in January of 1919. While there, it's interesting that one of his professors recognized his intellect and thought, if you would also get a degree in arts and sciences, you probably would have the possibility of becoming a Phi Beta Kappa. You cannot get a Phi Beta Kappa in engineering, at least at that time. So he did so, and he graduated with his degree in arts and sciences in May 1923, and then he graduated again in January of 1924 with a degree in agricultural engineering. What I have here is one of his engineering drawings from the 1920s. The reason it's shown is because it illustrates some of these complex geometric constructions that he was able to work out mathematically and to display here on paper. And we're going to see things later that will probably remind you of this. He also did things like surveying land, complex measurements, etc. And then, of course, he graduated, and here's the proof, 2 diplomas. Okay, so that's the making of an engineer, but there's this other, more less formal side of his education and his work, and that's the puzzler. He loved to create and solve puzzles. Ernest loved the puzzles. This is a jigsaw cut puzzle where all the pieces fit together and are held with one key piece. And in that case, it's this, this little gun turret coming out the side here. So he created this most likely on that treadle jigsaw because it was done in the 20s. He also loved carving. And here's an example of him. This is a piece of a chain that he carved from one single piece of wood. And then on this side, some more carving here, and then these jigsaw puzzles. And this one here in the front is one that it's actually 27 individual puzzles, more like this one here, that he put together and made into one big puzzle. So I think he set before himself some pretty large challenges, and he liked it. Well, the quilt that started it all. There is a link between the puzzle and the quilt. And let me just read you this story that was published in 1977 in the August issue of the Women's Circle magazine. And the article is called Quilts by the Dozen. And Ernest tells the story for the magazine. My wife was quilting the top that had been pieced by her grandmother. I had noticed that the corners of the blocks didn't meet too well. There was an overrun of as much as a ½ inch on some of them. I remarked that the old lady could have done a better job of fitting the blocks than that. As you can imagine, that might not have gone over well. His wife said, "If you can do any better, prove it or keep quiet." So I picked out a pattern, it was called a double T, drew out the cutting pattern, and had my wife buy the material. I didn't want the clerk to think I was odd, buying material to make a quilt. And then he goes on to tell the story, and that it was a problem to solve, to figure out how to make this quilt. And according to the family, this is the quilt that was that started it all. And it was discovered a number of years later inside another quilt. And they deconstructed and discovered it. Well, this possibly is that double T quilt that Ernest started with. The pattern is like 4 letter T's, really, to me, that are all meeting in the center. And it's yellow and green. Ernest Haight confessed probably 50 years after making this that that it didn't go so well the first time. He said that all the blocks were not the same size, and so it was a new puzzle. So he set them aside, and he thought about it, and then he decided, I'm going to sort them out. So he sorted them largest blocks down to the smallest, and he put all the largest ones in the top row, and then the next smallest group in the next, and next. And by the time he got to the bottom, it all worked. And the quilt, the corners met, it was perfect, except the quilt was 3 inches wider at one area than the next. But he also said he didn't tell his wife this until many, many, many years later. The quilt was hand quilted, and the story is that Ernest's father, Elmer, said, if Ernest can piece a quilt, I can hand quilt it. And so he did. Now, some background there that I think is a little more of the humor of the story is that Ernest's mother, Flora, was an expert quilter. She quilted with the Baptist Church women in David City, and her job was to mark all the quilts. Then she also participated in the quilting. She did quilting for hire, and then she quilted quilts for her own family. So, for Elmer to say, I will learn to hand quilt, he also was moving into his wife's area of expertise. So, like father, like son. Elmer quilted one quilt for each of Ernest's children. And this is another one of those called the Kaleidoscope Star. And there's an inscription along the far side here, as you see, that you may not be able to see, but it describes that this was quilted by Elmer and designed by Ernest. Now, to draw some of this together, just to show how prolific Ernest was, and in my research I've come up with at least 180 quilts that are still owned by family members. I've not met all of the family members, so that count is not complete. So maybe at least 200. He gave away many others as wedding gifts, baby gifts for people in their church. When he started machine quilting in about 1960, by the early 70s he said he had already machine quilted 100 quilts. So this was a prolific engineer, puzzler, quilt maker. And this is what he said. He said, when we have quilt shows, I show some of these puzzles, meaning those wooden puzzles that I showed you earlier, to illustrate that I am intrigued by puzzles and that every new quilt block pattern is a puzzle. To choose and arrange the colors, the different sizes and shapes of pieces, then how best to assemble them into blocks and quilt tops, preferably using assembly line methods. So that also introduces the next part of this presentation, which is his process. And it is all about the process. This is a picture taken in the late 1970s, early 1980s of Ernest Haight presenting one of his time-saving methods at a meeting of the Lincoln Quilters Guild. So he would puzzle out his work. He was finding the fastest way to do things. He was using his mind like an engineer would to solve a problem. The first part of his process was to find his patterns. He was not limited to looking at, let's say, a newspaper. Newspapers of the era often published quilt patterns, or magazines like the farm magazines that were published in Nebraska and other states. But he also, in this case, used wrapping paper. So here is some red and green wrapping paper, and there's a pencil mark that runs through right here and down this side to show the corners of the block, back this way and up. And so he found a geometric pattern that would work as a quilt block in wrapping paper. Then also this is the butterfly pattern, which is something that he made a couple of quilts from. That's a newspaper advertisement. Well, then the next step is to draft that pattern out. This is a pine tree pattern from a tree that I found in a book of his patterns and sources. And then here is maybe an adaptation that he put together of a pine tree pattern. But he was very familiar with drafting things, as you remember from the drawing earlier. He also experimented with color. Some of these look identical, but it's one pattern, and each one has a little different experimentation with the placement of color. So this shows his process of deciding what was going to make the most dramatic block. Here's another experimentation of color. He takes a single block, which is just two colors, white and a contrasting dark color, And by turning it 90, 180, 270 degrees, he can create these interesting geometric shapes and lines. It's shown in blue over here, and then in this brownish color here in the actual quilt. So it shows what he settled on. Then he needed to cut his templates so that he could then cut the pieces of fabric. His process for cutting templates was a bit different than maybe some would use. Here he has his drawn pattern of a block that's called patio tile. The blue lines are the lines that separate each block from each other, but the red lines are drawn a 1/4 inch beyond the edge, and those are the lines for cutting the fabric because there's extra cloth needed for the seam allowance. So rather than cut apart his pattern and then have no pattern anymore, he set a piece of cardboard underneath his pattern, set the pattern on top, and then with a needle he would poke holes at the corners of each piece, template piece, remove the pattern, and then draw lines between those holes, and he would have a perfect template. And that's what we see over here. All his templates that have a seam allowance in them for here. He also used an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the reason he did so, I'm not fully sure if he decided on a 1/4 inch, or I think more likely in process, he found out a way that he didn't have to mark any lines for sewing. And he did this by following the edge of his presser foot on his sewing machine. So he measured the distance from the needle to the edge of the presser foot, and it was a 1/4 inch. So he added a 1/4 inch to all of his pieces. Therefore, he just runs the edge of the fabric along the edge of the presser foot, and he will always have a consistent seam and perfect consistent blocks. Then his next step was to make a sample block, and this is a sample block of his patio tile. He did this in order to work out the best order in which to assemble all of the individual pieces of the block. And when he had done that, then he was able to start this assembly line method. Here's a couple more blocks that show his working out the best way to construct it. And then it's a time to cut them all out and assemble them. This is Ernest in his home near David City, and he's sitting at his electric sewing machine, so this is after 1960, and he is sewing away on a quilt top. He's well beyond the assembly line stage of making individual blocks. What Ernest also did was he used some time-saving approaches in his ways of piecing things. Again, he's working out the puzzle. This is part of the process. The bachelor's puzzle block, which is here, this is one that he made 5 or 6 quilts from, and I think that indicates that it remained a puzzle. There was a challenge to this one because he continued to do so. But what he did was he found ways to not have to deal with as many individual pieces, because as you see, this block has many individual pieces. Every time you change color, that's a new piece of cloth. But what he worked on here is this area here. This is where he made all of these triangles that are, or these squares that are half black and half white, like right here. So he put 2 pieces of fabric together, a white and a black. He drew diagonal lines and vertical and horizontal lines, and then he sewed on either side of them, cut them apart, and opened the triangles, and he had a dozen black and white squares. And that's what he needed for this block. Then he did something called strip piecing, which is where he would sew a dark, a light, a dark, and a light, and then he would cut them here, these various places horizontally, and he would have all the individual pieces he needed for a 9-patch block and also for this section right here. So he could very quickly, assembly line fashion, create his pieces for his quilt. And he was doing these things. I don't know if he was the innovator of them, but he certainly was one who made good advantage of them. and they are common practices now among contemporary quilt makers. This is shows a close-up. You can see his machine quilting, another way to save time. He worked out a way that he could quilt the whole quilt in about 8 to 10 hours without lifting his needle very often, very little starting and stopping. So that's his process. Now let's talk about his styles that he really liked. I say it's from kaleidoscopes to stained glass. As you see here, this is a rather involved piece of design here, and it's one of the types that he was especially interested in. This also tells you something. This is from the Quilter's Newsletter magazine. It was published in 1977. It's enthusiastically, I look forward eagerly for each issue. Boy, sometimes I can hardly keep from starting on a new pattern in spite of all the other quilt work I have going. I know a lot of contemporary quilt makers that feel the same way. So this kind of got in his blood, I think, and that's great. So what were the styles that he typically made? Well, there's a repeat block quilt where every block is the same pattern, and this one is one where he alternates colors between them, but basically it's the same layout. Here's another one that has sashing, which is these strips of cloth between each block. But he also liked these kaleidoscopic designs. Here's one that he worked out on paper with all the colors, and then here's the completed quilt in one of his children's homes. Huge designs and really complex. I mean, if you're going for speed, this is not what you would choose, but if you're going for challenge, yes, this is what you would do. Here's another great kaleidoscopic sort of design. This was inspired by an exhibit at the Nebraska State Fair by a student, and he sketched it out, came home, drew his pattern, and then figured out all the pieces and created the quilt. He was known also for his original borders. He would take a conventional pattern or a block pattern that was commonly used, but he would add his own trademark borders to it. And this is sort of a Greek key border. That was one of those examples. Another is this sort of Art Deco style border that was inspired by the bachelor's puzzle blocks. And as you notice here, the quilt is slightly folded down here, but the border is most of the quilt. Yes, but it's quite effective and very bold. Another style that he was known for was he would make multiple sizes of the same block and include them in one quilt. And so in this case, he has a very large nosegay of flowers, but he has surrounded by the smaller versions. Here's another one where he has multiple sizes of the same block. There's 3 different sizes here. That's really an effective design, striking piece. He liked big stars. This is what it was called the tulip star. It's all diamond-shaped pieces that create this shape. And then I call this a concentric star. It's just large stars with getting larger as you go out. This is a broken star and a pattern that came from like a newspaper, possibly the local newspaper or farm magazine, and then here's the quilt as it's worked out. Actually very good use of color. And then of course his signature border here with the Greek key. And as you're not surprised, complex geometric designs that often had many pieces. So here's the design for one, and of course it's sample block. And again, the bachelor's puzzle. This bachelor's puzzle came from a Nebraska farmer magazine and in the 1930s. So this was one of the quilts that he started working on rather early in his time, but continued to make. And another complex geometric pattern of interlocking or overlapping triangles. And then quilts that create or blocks that create secondary patterns. As you look at this, do you really know where the block is? it's lost because the block design merges. And the best way to find out is start in the corner and see where the block begins and ends. But that's what we say when there's secondary patterns created. Another one, secondary patterns. There's these largish star shapes here, but sometimes you look and here's like a pinwheel. So depending on how it catches you, you're seeing different things. And I think that was some of the fun that Ernest enjoyed. And then he also had this thing where he would take one block, enlarge it to be a whole quilt. He made about 50 of these that ended up being 24 to 36 inches square, and they were gifts for the St. Joseph home in David City, a retirement home. These would be given to the residents as sort of a lap robe. And then something called one-piece patterns. All of these pieces of cloth are a diamond shape, but they go together to create this all-over one-piece pattern. And here's another one, just squares. More. An intricate design over here that actually has sort of a southwest look to me, and then this more original design. And then the stained glass effects. This is maybe something he's best known for. Between every piece of the block, he has put a thin strip of black fabric, like the leading in stained glass. It ends up being an 1/8 inch wide. He wrote numerous letters to correspondents in the 70s and 80s, and he described this process. He would cut a 5/8 inch wide strip of black fabric, and if he had a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides, that removes a 1/2 inch, and he's left with an 1/8 inch. So he was able to keep a very consistent, thin black line between each piece. Here's another example where he used it to set off the center section of each block. And then one that actually looks like a stained glass window. These strips are actually wider than 1/8 inch, but very effective. I don't know if you can tell, but some of the fabrics, the calico prints in here, are rather gaudy. They look kind of like a pizza top or an explosion. This is what I think some of the humor of Ernest Haight. He was not too picky about his fabrics. He would use all cottons, cotton polyester. Today, most contemporary quilt makers are insistent on having only 100% cotton. He would use bed sheets because he would use those for backs mostly because it cut down steps. He didn't have to seam narrower strips of cloth together. Well, one of the stories that the family told me is when a dry goods store in David City was closing, they'd had things on liquidation for a long period of time, and it was at the end of the sale, and they still had a lot of fabric left, and they were offering it for 20 cents a yard. And so Ernest decided, he told the clerk, "I'll take it all." And so in one day, he bought 1,000 yards of leftover fabric. And I think that probably explains some of his fabric choices in the quilts that we see. And another thing he did, he completed previous generations' quilts. Like the quilt that his wife was quilting on, done by her grandmother, when he said it could be done better, he also, in his own time, took blocks made by ancestors and finished them out. So these blocks were made probably before 1920. He added the white sashing and the green corner posts and the interesting calico border. Okay, so we've talked about the making of an engineer, and we've talked about his being a puzzler and enjoying that process, and we talked about those specific steps of his process of finding his patterns and drawing them out, etc. And we've seen what he created. So what? Well, Ernest Haight is an interesting character because as a conservative man in the Great Plains in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, he went public with an unusual male hobby. He started displaying his quilts at county fairs in the 1940s. it wasn't long before he didn't send his wife into the quilt shop to buy the fabric, or the fabric store. He went and bought his own fabric. He was known to buy whole bolts at a time. They would ask him, "How much do you want?" He said, "All of it." Another reason he's significant is he self-published this book, Practical Machine Quilting for the Homemaker. And in it has his time-saving methods for machine quilting a quilt, for piecing like I showed you illustrations of. And he was very generous in sharing his techniques with numerous people. As he started to become known, he received letters from people all over the country. He received a number of letters from another man who was quilting, who lived in Houma, Louisiana. And this man was having trouble with the corners coming together on his blocks. And so Ernest basically tutored him through letters over a period of time. He also was an influence on people more contemporary, who some people in the contemporary traditional quilt world will know John Flynn. John Flynn is an engineer, trained as an engineer, who turned to quilt making similarly because he saw what his wife was doing and was intrigued. And he's worked out some time-saving processes as well that he markets. Other authors have included machine quilting in particular in their books that have been published by larger publishers and have had a wider distribution. So through Ernest, through these other authors, Ernest's methods have become more widely known. And of course, his importance was recognized early because he was inducted into the Nebraska State Quilt Guild's Hall of Fame in the middle 1980s. He was one of the original inductees along with Grace Snyder. So, just to tell you a bit more about what's next, The Engineer Who Could is the name of an exhibition that will be opening at the International Quilt Studies Center and Museum in July 2013, where we'll tell this story, but with his quilts in there in the galleries. Also, we're hoping to put together a catalog of quilts that are still in the Haight family's possession, and if possible, we'd like to make that available. And I'd like to examine more about how unusual it might have been for Ernest Haight to have been doing what he was doing in the Great Plains in the middle of the 20th century. And of course, possibly to share this research in a publication. So, and the last thing, I would like to include Isabel Hooper Haight in the story, a remarkable woman in her own right. Isabel was a fine pianist and a poet. She self-published her own poetry and taught piano lessons to many. A very interesting counterbalance to this analytical man that she was married to. So she will be in this larger story in the exhibition. And I thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.